können glücklich sein zu wissen, dass diese Zukunft restlos uns gehört.
Adolf Hitler had never disguised his belief that the Soviet Union would be his regime's ultimate enemy.
Der sich als Träger seines besten Blutes fühlen und dieses wissend zur Führung der Nation.
He hated communism and saw the vast open spaces and abundant natural resources of Soviet Russia as the prize which would finally enable the German people to become the master race. Throughout the early months of 1941, as he stayed at the Berghof, his country retreat in the Bavarian Alps, Hitler planned his greatest gamble. Operation Barbarossa, the assault on the Soviet Union. Steadily, his armies were redeployed to the east and re-equipped for what would be their greatest challenge. In theory, Stalin's Soviet Union was still Hitler's ally, and Stalin was keen to keep it that way, for his country was woefully unprepared for war. The mighty Red Army, once the largest and most technologically advanced in the world, had been devastated by Stalin's purges in the late 1930s. Some 3/4 of its senior officers had been shot or imprisoned. Despite appearances, there had been a catastrophic collapse in morale and efficiency. As German soldiers now flooded into neighboring Poland, Stalin, desperate to maintain the peace, gave orders that nothing should be done to offend Hitler. But Hitler had one other task to perform before he could push on to Russia. He needed to secure his southern flank. Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary were Germany's firm allies. But in March 1941, the Yugoslav government, sympathetic to Germany, was overthrown by pro-British forces. Its next-door neighbor, Greece, was also pro-British. So, on April the 6th, 1941, the German army invaded the Balkans. "33 German divisions moved into Yugoslavia. They swiftly tore its defenses apart. The capital, Belgrade, surrendered on April the 12th. Greece fell almost as quickly. Despite British help, Athens was captured in less than 3 weeks. The way was now clear for Operation Barbarossa. Over 4 million men were to be deployed. They were supported by more than 3,000 aircraft. The plan called for 3 simultaneous thrusts. Army Group North would overrun the Baltic states and seize Leningrad. Army Group Center was to advance to Moscow. And Army Group South would occupy the Ukraine. Hitler's generals went silent when he showed them the plan. They were worried it was too ambitious and would spread their forces too thinly. But none dared voice their doubts. The Red Army was much bigger. It had nearly 2 million men within striking distance of the Western Front and millions more in reserve. The Russians also had more than 20,000 tanks, far outnumbering Germany's 6,000. They were older and less powerful, but they were still a formidable fighting force. The issue for Germany was, could its superior technology and speed overwhelm the Russians before the Red Army's vast numbers ground them down? Operation Barbarossa began at 3:15 a.m. on June the 22nd, 1941. The Luftwaffe joined in at dawn, targeting Soviet airfields. Simultaneously, the ground attack began. The Germans swiftly crossed the River Bug on the border between Poland and the Soviet Union. Hitler's panzers were soon thrusting deep into Soviet territory. Within 2 days, the panzers had penetrated more than 50 miles. Ill-coordinated Red Army counterattacks were swiftly brushed aside. Tens of thousands of Soviet prisoners were rounded up. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe had total domination of the air. The Red Army's leadership seemed paralyzed by the German onrush. On June the 29th, 7 days after the start of the assault, 2 panzer thrusts met up near Minsk, surrounding huge pockets of Soviet troops. As the follow-up infantry arrived, more than 300,000 prisoners were taken. Often the Germans found themselves welcomed as liberators, particularly in the Ukraine, where anti-Russian feeling was widespread. In Moscow, Stalin appeared to have suffered a near breakdown at the news of his betrayal by Hitler. He remained silent for more than a week. Not until July the 3rd did he appeal to his people's patriotism to save the motherland. In Britain, the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, received the news of Operation Barbarossa with very different feelings. It meant the country no longer stood alone. He announced that any enemy of Nazi Germany was a friend of Britain's, no matter what the political differences in the past. He then sent a mission to Moscow to sign a treaty of mutual assistance with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. But apart from sending aid by sea, there was little Britain could do immediately to help the Soviet Union. As June turned to July, the German blitzkrieg slashed deeper into Soviet territory. It was beginning to look as if nothing could stop Hitler, but he was about to make his first major strategic blunder. In early July 1941, over 300,000 Red Army troops were surrounded west of Minsk. Hitler's panzer commanders, in particular General Heinz Guderian, begged to be allowed to race on. Operation Barbarossa was working like clockwork. Within a week, the panzers were at Smolensk, deep inside Russia and only a couple of hundred miles from Moscow. On July the 22nd, a panzer pincer movement met to the east of Smolensk, trapping another 310,000 Soviet troops. Here there was a brief pause, while the rest of the army caught up. Though the tanks could move at spectacular speed, most of the army still had to walk or rely on horse-drawn transport. But it still only took them 5 days before they arrived and began mopping up. The operation was completed in just 9 more days. Vast columns of Soviet prisoners began trudging west to captivity. Over 2.5 million never returned.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to watch everything, from the gripping story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
Moscow was now only 200 miles away, and the road lay open. It seemed certain it would fall by the end of the summer, as planned. But elsewhere, the German advance was finding the going more difficult. The Red Army was counter-attacking more effectively, and by mid-July, Army Group South was still more than 50 miles from Kiev. Hitler decided Guderian's panzers should delay their advance on Moscow and swing south to Kiev to provide help. Guderian objected strongly, but Hitler was adamant. There should be no further advance on Moscow until Kiev had fallen. It would turn out to be a fateful decision. There were already worrying signs the Red Army was not going to be the pushover Hitler had been expecting. Soviet manpower seemed endless. More than 16 million troops were now mobilized. And the Red Army now had some formidable new weapons. In particular, a new tank, the 37-ton T-34. It had a 76mm gun and was faster and better cross-country than the Panzer Mark IV. Yet, as the blitzkrieg continued, it was easy to miss the warning signs. Guderian's Panzer Group began its thrust south on August the 23rd, 1941. The panzers of Army Group South struck north 3 weeks later. The pincers met east of Kiev on September the 16th. Two more Soviet armies were utterly destroyed. 500,000 men were killed or captured. On the same day, more than 1,000 miles to the north, Army Group North surrounded the city of Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg. It was immediately cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. The city was besieged. Hitler decided not to storm it, and the German troops settled down to starve it into surrender. Conditions in the city became dire. The only link to the rest of the Soviet Union was across Lake Ladoga to the east, but only a small amount of food could come in by water. Starvation set in. Over 11,000 people died in November. Not until December could an ice road be opened across the lake, and there was a slight increase in rations. But 3,700 people died of starvation on one day in December alone. Meanwhile, Army Group Center now prepared for the final assault on Moscow. Guderian's panzers had rejoined it to lead the blitzkrieg. The Germans had a 2-to-1 superiority in tanks and men at the front, and 3-to-1 in aircraft. The assault started on September the 20th, 1941. Once again, Guderian's panzers slashed deep through the Red Army. By October the 7th, yet more Soviet troops were surrounded. But Stalin was determined to defend Moscow to the last. He appointed Marshal Georgy Zhukov to organize the defense of the city. The people of Moscow were mobilized to dig a series of defensive lines. But the real obstacle to German advance would be the weather. On October the 8th, heavy rains set in. German vehicles soon became bogged down in a sea of mud. By late October, appalling weather and an increasingly stubborn Soviet resistance meant Army Group Center was still some 50 miles short of Moscow. Hitler was finally paying the price for his decision earlier in the year to delay his advance on Moscow. At around the same time, Army Group South reached the Black Sea, trapping yet more Soviet soldiers. Another 100,000 prisoners were taken. But they too were hampered by the weather. Even so, the city of Kharkov was captured on October the 24th, 1941. But the weather was now starting to freeze. The German forces, confident the campaign would be over by the summer, were caught unprepared. With no winter clothing, they now suffered terribly. On the Moscow front, Army Group Center was now beginning its final push to capture the Soviet capital. By December the 4th, its leading units were just 19 miles from Red Square. Some reconnaissance patrols claimed they could see the golden domes of the Kremlin glinting in the distance. But that night, the temperature plunged again. Tank engines would not start. Weapons froze. Many soldiers were severely frostbitten. On December the 5th, the Germans halted the attack. Winter had come to the rescue of the Red Army. But the Germans were confident that come the spring, they could finish the job. For much of autumn 1941, Stalin's armies reeled under the German onslaught. But all the while, he had another worry, that the Japanese would attack his forces in Siberia. But in November, the Soviet dictator received a message from his top spy in Japan, assuring him the Japanese had no such intention. Immediately, more than 30 divisions began moving west along the Trans-Siberian Railway to Moscow. They were well equipped and well trained in winter fighting. By early December, more than 500,000 extra men were in position near the capital. On December the 5th, just as the Germans were abandoning their attempt to capture Moscow, they were hit by a savage Russian attack. First came a massive Soviet artillery barrage. Then swarms of Soviet T-34s crashed through the German defenses. Stunned by the savagery of the attack by an enemy they had assumed was on the ropes, the Germans fell back. For the next 7 days, the Soviet troops tore into the German forces. For Hitler, who had only reluctantly agreed to halt the attack on Moscow, it was a terrible blow. On December the 19th, he sacked his overall commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, and assumed command himself. Heinz Guderian was also sacked, along with 35 other senior officers. Hitler now ordered that there would be no more retreats. The German troops should fight, and if necessary, die where they stood. It worked. The German line gradually steadied. But Stalin, elated by the Red Army's success, now demanded a massive advance across the whole front. Marshal Zhukov, one of Stalin's most trusted commanders, tried to dissuade him, but Stalin was determined. For the next 4 months, fighting swirled inconclusively around the German defensive positions. For Hitler, this was a very uncomfortable situation. He was used to, and expected, quick results. Now he was dangerously bogged down in the Soviet Union and facing an enemy that never seemed to give up. Nor was Russia his only headache. On December the 7th, 1941, Germany's ally Japan attacked the United States without warning. Hitler, with almost no thought, also declared war on the US. With no advanced planning, he had taken on a massive new enemy. As 1941 became 1942, Hitler remained determined to go on the offensive again in Russia. But he needed a new strategy. The original plan of fighting across the whole front was no longer tenable. Moreover, as his economic advisors told him, Germany's oil supplies were running low. So he decided to halt the attacks in the north and instead head for Russia's oil fields in the south. The initial plan for Operation Blue, as it was called, envisaged an assault south of Kharkov, with Army Group A swinging down to seize the oil fields, while Army Group B covered its flank along the River Don. Straight away, there was a brutal encounter with Soviet forces trying to retake Kharkov. Another 200,000 Soviet troops were captured. 70,000 were killed. As part of the same operation, the Germans tightened their siege of the port of Sebastopol in the Crimea. For 8 months, the defenders had been under constant bombardment from German artillery, including a massive 400mm railway gun. In late June 1942, Sebastopol finally fell to the Germans. It was now safe to head for the oil fields. On June the 28th, the offensive began. Army Group B forced its way through to the River Don and advanced along its western bank. Army Group A faced stronger resistance. But by July the 9th, it was close to Rostov. Hitler now made a series of what would turn out to be serious strategic blunders. As Army Group B made its way along the Don, the Führer ordered it to capture Stalingrad, even though the city had no immediate strategic significance. The army had suddenly been given a massive new task. 2 weeks later, Hitler compounded his misjudgment. Frustrated by the slow progress of the campaign in the Caucasus, he diverted the bulk of his panzers down to the mountains. The march on Stalingrad slowed noticeably. The reinforced Army Group A now raced across the Caucasus to within 70 miles of the Caspian, threatening to cut off all the Soviet armies in the area. But then Hitler changed his mind again. Enraged by Army Group B's slow progress to Stalingrad, he now ordered the panzers back up north. On August the 9th, Army Group A seized the first of the southern oil fields at Mykop. It found them comprehensively trashed. But without reinforcements, it could get no further, and the huge oil fields in the central Caucasus and those near the Caspian Sea remained beyond its grasp. But by now, Hitler's attention had shifted again. In late August, German forces were within striking distance of Stalingrad. The assault on the city, which bore the name of Hitler's arch-enemy, had begun. It would be one of the most crucial battles of World War II. On August the 17th, 1942, General Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army crossed the Don and began a final push on Stalingrad. Six days later, one panzer thrust had reached the Volga River just north of the city, and German forces were fighting in the outer suburbs. Hitler seemed poised for a famous victory. Stalingrad was an important industrial center. It straggled for more than 12 miles along the west bank of the river. Its factories produced over a quarter of the Soviet Union's tractors and trucks, as well as tanks and guns. The Russian people had turned it into a formidable fortress. They had been helped by Hitler's decision to send Army Group B's panzers to the south. This had given them another 2 weeks to prepare. The German plan was to make a direct assault on the city. Now began one of the most prolonged and intense battles of World War II. Slowly, the Germans edged forward, street by street, with Stuka dive bombers blitzing just ahead of them. The fighting was savage, house to house, room by room. The Soviet defenders used the sewers for shelter and communications, and the ruins above for sniping. Russian reinforcements had to be brought across the river. Often they were under assault from the air. But even so, thousands got through. By late September, the Germans had pushed their way through most of the city, almost to the Volga. For Hitler, the capture of Stalingrad was now an obsession. On October the 4th, 1942, General Paulus launched what was meant to be the final assault on Stalingrad. Tanks led the way, grinding over the rubble and firing point blank into courtyards. One German officer said, "The advance is measured in corpses, not meters." German victory seemed certain, but in fact, the Germans were dangerously overextended. By mid-November, the Soviet army was bringing in reinforcements. More than 1 million troops, 13,500 guns, 900 tanks, and over 1,000 aircraft were secretly moved to the battle zone. On November the 19th, they attacked the Germans' northern flank. After a massive artillery barrage, the T-34s and assault infantry burst through the German positions. Now it was the Germans who surrendered in their thousands. The next day, a Soviet assault in the south was equally successful. And on November the 23rd, these pincer movements met west of Stalingrad, cutting off the German 6th Army. General Paulus, in charge of the German forces, could have broken out, but Hitler ordered him to stand and fight. The Führer had been assured by the Luftwaffe that sufficient supplies could be airlifted into Stalingrad. This was enough for him to announce that the German positions must hold out until relieved. To help Paulus, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the overall German commander in the region, launched Operation Winter Storm on December the 12th. It was an attempt by the German panzers to break the Soviet encirclement of the city. For 2 days it went well, but then Red Army resistance increased. By December the 23rd, the German rescue attempt had ground to a halt about 30 miles from the city. Manstein advised the beleaguered Paulus to attempt to break out of Stalingrad. But Paulus wanted Hitler's permission. This was refused. It was probably too late anyway. Marshal Zhukov now unleashed the next stage of his master plan. It was a massive assault on the Panzer Relief Operation. The panzers were pushed back, away from the city, and by the end of December, all hope of relieving the German forces in Stalingrad had gone. Worse still, plans to airlift aid into the city were a fiasco. The German troops needed 700 tons of supplies a day to survive. They never received more than 80. The weather was too bad, and the Red Air Force now commanded the skies. Steadily, the Soviet troops squeezed in on the encircled Germans. 200,000 men were trapped. On January the 8th, the Soviets called on the Germans to surrender. They refused. On January the 31st, 1943, Paulus was forced to surrender. Over 100,000 men stumbled off into captivity. Only 5,000 would ever return to Germany. Stalingrad had been a bloody battle. The Germans had been savaged. They had lost some 300,000 of their men and at least as many of their allies. The Russians had lost about the same number, including thousands of civilians. It was Germany's greatest catastrophe in the war so far, but it wouldn't be the last. The Red Army was now inflicting massive defeats on Hitler's forces across the whole Eastern Front. Stalingrad had been a great triumph for the Soviet army. Now its operational commander, Marshal Zhukov, set his sights on Germany's Army Group A, still camped in the Caucasus. Soviet troops thrust their way west of Stalingrad, and by early December 1942 were within 120 miles of Rostov. There was a real possibility all the German forces in the south would be cut off. With little choice, Hitler reluctantly gave Army Group A permission to fall back. Over the next month, the Germans fought a skillful rearguard action. Hundreds of thousands of troops withdrew. Then, on January the 12th, 1943, Zhukov launched an all-out assault. The Soviets attacked along a 500-mile front. Outnumbered 7-1, von Manstein, the overall commander of German forces in the region, fought a brilliant mobile retreat. But by the end of February, the Red Army had recaptured both Kursk and the nearby city of Kharkov. This Russian winter offensive had struck a crippling blow to German power. Over a matter of months, it had lost 1 million men and vast numbers of tanks and guns. The Red Army still had enormous reserves of manpower. It was also benefiting from a huge increase in weapons production and aid from the United States and Britain. The Germans also no longer had the technological upper hand. The T-34 tank was more than a match for the Panzer Mark IV. And they also had the terrifying Katyusha multiple rocket system, which shattered German troops. Yet Hitler refused to give up hope. He still dreamed of a preemptive summer assault that would throw the Soviet Union off balance and regain the initiative. The city of Kursk seemed the obvious place to start. Here, the Soviet assault had pushed a bulge deep into the German lines. It looked temptingly exposed. Hitler decided it should be cut off and annihilated. He also had an ace up his sleeve. The German counterattack would be led by a new generation of German tanks, specially designed to combat the formidable Russian T-34. The massive but slow 55-ton Tiger had a lethal 88mm gun, and its frontal armor made it almost impervious to Soviet tank guns. And then there was the faster 43-ton Panther with a new 75mm gun, also capable of knocking out the T-34. These tanks were so new, Hitler was forced to delay the attack whilst sufficient numbers were manufactured and delivered to the front. But even as the German forces began to assemble, the Soviet commander, Marshal Zhukov, guessed what was about to happen. Soon afterwards, he received information from a Soviet spy ring inside the German High Command, confirming the site of the attack. Zhukov ordered the construction of a series of defensive lines with anti-tank ditches, minefields, and deep belts of barbed wire. He also massively built up Soviet forces in the area, pulling in troops and tanks from less vulnerable parts of the front. By the eve of the assault on Kursk, the Germans were hugely outnumbered by Soviet defenders, who also knew exactly when the Germans would attack. On July the 5th, 1943, just as the German troops prepared to assault, they were hit by a huge Soviet artillery bombardment. Even so, the next morning, the panzers still rolled forward. But this time, they were up against a well-entrenched enemy. There was no realistic chance of a lightning blitzkrieg breakthrough. The results were disastrous. In the north, the German army gained a mere 6 miles for the loss of 25,000 men and more than 200 tanks. In the south, the Germans fared a little better. A wedge 25 miles deep was driven into the Soviet defenses, but it also came at a high price. 10,000 men were killed and 350 tanks destroyed. But for a brief moment, it looked as if a German breakthrough might be possible. Then Zhukov threw in his reserves. On July the 12th, 1943, 900 tanks charged into the German flank. Almost 2,000 tanks now engaged in what was the largest armored battle of World War II. The Soviet T-34s drove into the German lines and opened fire at point-blank range. After a single day of brutal combat, the Germans had lost a further 350 tanks and were retreating. Meanwhile, overhead, there was an epic air battle. Eventually, the Soviet Air Force established supremacy over the Luftwaffe. Now the Russians could unleash their formidable Ilyushin IL-2 Stormovik tank killers. By July the 23rd, the Germans had lost any ground they had gained, and with it, the cream of their army. Hitler's adventure at Kursk had cost him at least 50,000 troops and more than 700 tanks. Never again would the Germans launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. the Russians had turned the tide of the war. Summer 1943, and on the Eastern Front, Hitler's armies were in retreat. Huge Soviet artillery barrages and tank assaults were shredding the German lines. Hitler, by now, was fighting a war on two fronts. In Western Europe, an Anglo-American force was moving up through Italy, menacing his southern flank. The Germans had been forced to pull some of their elite troops back from the Eastern Front to help. It left their forces in the east dangerously overstretched. The exhausted German soldiers were up against the enormous reserves of the huge Soviet military machine. The Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, now seized this opportunity to wreak his revenge and move onto the offensive. By early August 1943, the Red Army had driven the Germans from the cities of Orel and Belgorod. To celebrate the victories, Stalin ordered 12 124-gun salvos and a barrage of fireworks in Moscow's Red Square. He proclaimed, "Eternal glory to the heroes who fell in the struggle for freedom. Death to the German invaders." In Germany, Hitler's response was to take greater personal control of all important military decisions. The effects were felt almost immediately by Axis troops occupying the strategically important city of Kharkov. The Soviet forces approached the city from three sides. The German commander, Erich von Manstein, ordered a tactical withdrawal. Hitler immediately countermanded it. Kharkov should be held at all costs. Hitler would not accept anything that would reduce what he called Lebensraum, the land he believed Germany needed to ensure its greatness. Just as importantly, he also believed Germany would win the war, if not by numbers, then by the sheer will to win. The Germans dug in. At first, it seemed to work. For several days, repeated Soviet assaults were repulsed. More than 300 Russian T-34 tanks were destroyed. But by the end of August 1943, the German positions had been overrun. Eventually, Manstein went against his Führer. He ordered his men to get out. The Red Army drove into the ruins of Kharkov the next day. It marked the beginning of a massive Soviet offensive along a 1,500-mile front. It stretched from Rostov in the south to Smolensk in the north. At the southern end of the front, near Rostov, a Russian breakthrough threatened to trap pockets of German soldiers in the Crimea. Once again, Manstein asked permission to withdraw. All he got was a message from Hitler: "Don't do anything, I am coming myself." But he never did. The German military was forced into another last-minute, chaotic retreat. The withdrawal was made worse by bands of battle-hardened partisans. Many were former Red Army soldiers who had been cut off behind enemy lines. They now ambushed the retreating Germans, cutting their communication and supply lines. The Germans responded with predictable ferocity. There were savage reprisals against the civilian population. The Germans also launched a scorched earth policy. Factories, power plants, railways and bridges were all blown up. A massive hydroelectric dam, which provided electricity for the whole of the Ukraine, was wrecked. Meanwhile, in the center of the front, the Germans fell back across the river Dnieper. As they fled, they blew up yet more bridges, turning the river into a formidable defensive line. They then dug in along the west bank. Stalin's response was to offer the Soviet Union's highest award to the first Red Army soldier to cross the river. By the early autumn 1943, a number of small Soviet bridgeheads had been established on the German-controlled West Bank. But they met determined German resistance. Fighting raged along the Dnieper throughout October 1943. Finally, at the beginning of November, Soviet troops captured Kiev. All along the river, the Germans were pushed out of their defensive positions and forced to retreat still further west. By the end of 1943, the Red Army had virtually cleared the Germans out of Russia's historic homeland. They were now moving west across the Ukraine. The countries of Europe were in their sights. By spring 1944, Hitler's armies were in full retreat. The Soviet leadership now poured in ever greater quantities of men and equipment. The Germans had two excellent tanks, the Tiger I and the Panzer Mark V Panther. Both were well suited to the sort of mobile defensive warfare which was the only remaining hope for the German armies on the Eastern Front. But the Red Army had at least twice as many tanks, mostly the battle-tried T-34, and armament factories in Siberia were turning out more at a rate of 2,000 a month. While Hitler was forced to divide his forces between a war on two fronts, Stalin's war machine was working flat out. 6 million Soviet troops faced less than 3 million Germans. In early January 1944, the forces of the First Ukrainian Front moved in from the north on the German-held town of Korsun. It was the last German toehold on what they'd hoped would be their defensive line along the river Dnieper. 12 days later, the forces of the Second Ukrainian Front drove forward on the southern side. The attack followed a by now well-established Soviet pattern. First, there was a build-up of an overwhelming number of troops. The Germans were never quite sure where the first assault would come from. Then there was a devastating artillery bombardment. Next, the massed tanks of the Red Army would punch a hole through the German defenses. Finally, the infantry poured in. In Korsun, it quickly became obvious to the Germans they were about to be overwhelmed. The German commander, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, flew to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia to beg, yet again, for permission to pull out. But Hitler once more refused. After a week of fierce fighting, about 60,000 men were trapped in what became known as the Korsun pocket. The Soviets called it Little Stalingrad. The German forces now attempted to break out. But the Russians were ready for it. T-34 tanks and Cossack horsemen harried the Germans as they tried to escape. The fighting lasted 2 days. By the time Korsun fell, the Germans had lost some 30,000 men. The Red Army forces were now moving forward at speed. Their advance was made possible by fleets of trucks, mostly provided by the United States, that kept their forces supplied. It was a much faster process than for the Germans, who still relied heavily on horses. The Russians were also dominating the skies. The Luftwaffe had always been a key part of the German war machine. But Hitler had been forced to divert many of his aircraft to defend the homeland from a US and British bomber offensive. As a result, Russian planes outnumbered the Luftwaffe 5-1. The Red Air Force's Sturmwik fighter bombers took a heavy toll on German armor and supply columns. Yet Hitler refused to contemplate defeat, and now announced a new version of his no-retreat policy. He ordered the German troops to create what he called fortified areas, or local strongholds. These were to be defended to the bitter end. Only with his personal approval could any of these fortresses be abandoned. It was a desperate ploy, and would come to cost the Germans dearly. One of the first tests of the new strategy was near the Ukrainian town of Kamenets-Podolsky. Here, 20 divisions of panzers were threatened with being cut off. But Hitler declared it a fortified area and refused to allow a retreat. In the face of bitter fighting, there was a vitriolic argument between Hitler and Manstein, who could see the writing on the wall. Finally, Manstein got his way, and the panzers were given permission to break out. Ten days later, some 200,000 men of the 1st Panzer Army safely reached the German lines over 100 miles to the west. But they had lost most of their heavy equipment and weapons. By now, Manstein's requests to retreat had become too much for Hitler. The field marshal was sacked. Further south, the Germans attempted to hold back the Soviet torrent on the Yezhny Bug River. They failed, and a large force of Germans was caught behind Russian lines in the Black Sea port of Odessa. They too faced being cut off. In early April 1944, Hitler declared it a fortress. But the German troops ignored him and slipped out of the city. Several days later, on April the 10th, Odessa was liberated. Stalin was winning on all fronts. He could now turn his attention to the northern Russian city that had suffered under Nazi assault for years. By the beginning of 1944, the Russian city of Leningrad had been under siege from German forces for nearly 2.5 years. During the first winter, almost 500,000 people had starved to death. Volunteers struggled to put out fires and construct defenses. But by 1944, life in the city had become almost unbearable. Several attempts to relieve it had failed. One effort in 1942 led to the capture of more than 50,000 troops of the Soviet Second Shock Army. Another, in 1943, had enabled a trickle of supplies to get into the city. But even so, throughout 1943, up to 20,000 people continued to die of cold, disease and starvation every month. By January 1944, however, with the Germans in headlong retreat, Stalin now turned his attention to the plight of the city. That month, Soviet forces secretly infiltrated the neighboring peninsula around Oranienburg. The attack on the German positions started with a savage 65-minute bombardment. Then Russian troops ripped into the startled German lines. At the same time, another Soviet force attacked from the northeast around the city. They too burst onto the German lines. For 3 days, the German commander, Field Marshal Georg von Köckler, held out. Finally, he asked Hitler for permission to fall back. Hitler, as always, refused. Küchler argued back, telling the Führer only a swift withdrawal would save his army from a massacre. Hitler sacked him. He was replaced by General Walter Mödel. He was known as Hitler's fireman for his fierce loyalty and avid Nazi outlook. But even to Mödel, the danger was obvious. He now disobeyed Hitler and pulled out. After 2.5 years, the siege of Leningrad was finally lifted. Nearly 1 million Russian civilians had died. Relief in the city was overwhelming. The first fallout was in neighboring pro-German Finland, which now feared a Soviet invasion. So in March 1944, a secret Finnish delegation arrived in Moscow to discuss peace. Stalin's terms were harsh. He demanded the Petsamo region in the far north of Finland, an area rich in nickel, an important ingredient in the manufacture of metal alloys. He also demanded reparations of $600 million. The Finns refused and prepared for a Soviet invasion. But Finland could wait. The Soviet High Command, or Stavka as it was known, had more pressing business further south. The Red Army offensives in the Ukraine in late 1943 had trapped 120,000 German troops in the Crimea. Hitler, as ever, had refused to allow them to withdraw. They now waited helplessly for a Soviet onslaught. In early April, 2 months after the lifting of the siege on Leningrad, it came. The troops of the 4th Ukrainian Front crashed into the Crimea from the north. At the same time, a diversionary attack landed on the eastern end of the peninsula. In less than a day, the Axis troops in the west had given way. They fell back on the port of Sebastopol, and Hitler ordered Fortress Sebastopol to hold out to the last man. They didn't stand a chance. Within 2 weeks of the siege, German troops were being evacuated by sea. 40,000 men escaped, but some 30,000 defenders were still trapped in the port. They retreated to the beaches south of the city, hoping to be rescued by more German ships. it didn't happen. The evacuation was interrupted by a Soviet artillery bombardment. Three days later, the Germans surrendered. Meanwhile, back in the northwest of the country, the Germans still occupied much of what is Belarus today. But the Red Army had grabbed a vast bulge of land stretching into Poland and Romania. It meant the Germans had to defend a 1,400-mile front. They were hugely overextended. Military logic suggested it was time for the Germans to withdraw to more manageable defensive positions. But Hitler, still obsessed with territorial gain, refused to allow any further retreat. The German military would continue to pay a high price for Hitler's constant meddling and unrealistic ambitions. By the spring of 1944, Hitler's forces were stretched to their limit. All along the Eastern Front, there was a desperate need for reinforcements. The problem for the German High Command was where to place the few resources it had to maximum advantage. German intelligence reports suggested the next big Red Army offensive would be into Belarus. But Hitler disagreed. He was convinced Stalin would strike south and seize the Romanian oil fields. Both were wrong, at least to begin with. In the early summer, the Red Army Command finally turned its attention to Finland. Russian troops attacked across the Karelian Isthmus. After 2 days fighting, the Finns were forced to retreat. Slowly, over the next month, the Red Army advanced north into Finland. By August 1944, it was all over, and the Finns sued for peace. It was now that Stalin showed the first signs of a pattern that would be repeated across Europe. He seized land, in this case areas of Finnish Karelia and the nickel-rich Petsamo region. Next, Stalin's attention turned to Central Europe. In the summer of 1944, he launched what he called Operation Barbarossa, named after a Russian hero of the Napoleonic Wars. At 5 a.m. on June the 22nd, 3 years to the day after Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, the guns of the Red Army began a ferocious bombardment of German forces in what today is Belarus. It was exactly where, months earlier, German intelligence reports had suggested a Soviet attack would come. But because Hitler had ignored them, the area was poorly defended. It was another of his mistakes. The Germans were now being pounded along a 350-mile front. In some places, the Russians used over 400 guns for every mile. The barrage was followed, as always, by a torrent of Soviet tanks and infantry crashing into the German defenses. To make matters worse for the Germans, they had almost no air support. Much of the Luftwaffe was still tied up defending the German homeland. It was now that Hitler's folly of fighting a war on two fronts became all too apparent. The Red Air Force could operate almost unopposed. Russian planes struck deep behind German lines, cutting communications and harassing reinforcements. Within 36 hours, the German panzers had been swept aside. About 50,000 men faced encirclement in the German-held town of Vitebsk. Hitler, as had become routine, initially refused to let it retreat. Then, when on the following day he relented, it was too late for many of his troops. 4 days later, Vitebsk fell. 20,000 Axis troops were killed and 10,000 taken prisoner. Further south, along the Belarus front, the pattern was repeated. Hitler, now furious, sacked his general, Field Marshal Ernst Busch. Once again, he brought in his favorite, the now promoted Field Marshal Walter Mödel. But it made no difference. Town after town fell. The regional capital of Minsk was now within reach. Two days later, the Red Army encircled it. Over 100,000 German troops were trapped. Soviet forces bombarded. Within a week, the German survivors surrendered. The unstoppable Russian advance now pushed on to the Baltic states. First of all was the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius. Across the entire eastern front, the Germans were in retreat. But they left behind them towns and countryside laid waste. They committed widespread atrocities against local inhabitants. Nothing, however, could have prepared the Red Army for what it was about to discover. On July the 23rd, 1944, Soviet forces reached the small Polish village of Majdanek, near Lublin. Here they came across their first evidence of Hitler's final solution: the Majdanek extermination camp. It was a camp designed for the murder of Jews on an industrial scale. But as the first Soviet reports of what they'd found leaked out, the Western Allies simply dismissed them. Three days after seizing Majdanek, the Russians were approaching Warsaw. But here the Red Army paused. Stalin now stood ready to do what Hitler had done before: grab land, not in the name of Lebensraum, but of communism. By the summer of 1944, Operation Barbarossa had ripped the heart out of the German army in the east. More than 300,000 Axis soldiers had died. $150,000 had been taken prisoner. The Red Army now paused and dug in along the river Vistula, south of Warsaw. Stalin was in no hurry to bring the war to an end. With Europe in turmoil, conditions were ideal for the spread of communism. The first victims of Stalin's political calculations were the Poles. On August 1st, 1944, the Polish Home Army rose up in Warsaw against its Nazi occupiers. But it desperately needed help. The Red Army, camped just to the south, was perfectly placed to provide it. But Stalin regarded the Polish Home Army as close to the Polish government in exile in London and hostile to communism. So he turned a blind eye to the plight of the Polish fighters. They were crushed with terrible brutality. The Germans wouldn't finally be pushed out of Poland until the Russian army drove them out in January 1945. It was the start of a Soviet master plan that would eventually see communist governments across most of Eastern Europe. To the north, contingents of the Red Army continued to clear the Germans out of the Baltic states. These would later be incorporated into the Soviet Union. Near the Latvian capital of Riga, over 200,000 Germans were trapped behind Russian lines. But Hitler, still determined to hold on to his Lebensraum, refused to countenance a retreat. Even so, gradually the German forces were pushed back to the Baltic coast. By mid-October 1944, the Germans had been squeezed onto the Courland Peninsula, west of Riga. They would remain marooned there for the rest of the war, when they eventually surrendered to Soviet forces. Stalin, meanwhile, was already sizing up other territory in Eastern Europe. He could have moved directly west towards Germany. Instead, units of the Red Army moved south in a vast thrust down through the Balkans. Nearly 1,500 tanks and 1 million men pushed into Romania in late August 1944. The defending Axis forces had less than 400 tanks and just 800,000 troops. Pro-German Romanian troops gave way almost immediately all along the front. Three days later, large pockets of German troops were surrounded near Chisinau. Hitler issued his standard command: no retreat. For 9 days, there was bitter fighting. Over 180,000 German troops were killed or taken prisoner. The remainder beat a belated retreat. In late August, Romania's pro-German dictator, Marshal Ion Antonescu, was arrested. Romania surrendered. By the end of the month, the Red Army was in Bucharest and had occupied the strategically important Romanian oil fields. It meant Germany had lost its main supply of oil. 3 Soviet armies now moved south into Bulgaria. Bulgaria had tried to stay neutral, but it too would soon be swallowed up by the Soviet Empire. Meanwhile, the rest of the Russian forces now moved west towards Yugoslavia. German troops to the south, in Greece, faced being trapped. They began a hasty retreat up through Albania and southern Yugoslavia. They were harried all the way by Albanian and Yugoslav partisans. By mid-October 1944, the Red Army had reached the Yugoslav capital of Belgrade. Only now did it begin to swing north and west towards Hungary and then Germany. German reinforcements poured into Hungary to support the pro-Nazi puppet government, but the Red Army ground on. Eight weeks later, it laid siege to Budapest. The siege lasted over 6 weeks before the German puppet government collapsed. By the end of 1944, most of Eastern Europe lay in Stalin's grasp. His troops controlled the Baltic states and Poland, Romania and Bulgaria. Pro-Soviet forces ruled in Yugoslavia and Albania. Hungary and Czechoslovakia were in his sights. Stalin had successfully laid the foundations for the future Soviet bloc. He could now, at last, move on to Germany. But in the West, Allied forces were also approaching the German border. The race was on to be the first to take Berlin. In 1944, and on the Eastern Front, Hitler's forces were being pushed back towards the German border. But Germany was about to face a new threat. In the West, Allied forces had been preparing for months to open a new front in northwest France. Training for it was well underway. But it was an attack Hitler had long been expecting. His problem was knowing when, and above all where, it would come. The stage was set for one of the greatest battles of World War II, D-Day, the Allied landings along the Normandy coast of France. Since the early years of the war, Britain's Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, had always been certain that at some point an Allied invasion of Northern Europe would be necessary. The only questions were when, where, and how. To test the waters, British forces had already mounted a number of practice operations. In December 1941, British commandos raided the Vargso Islands off the coast of Nazi-occupied Norway. It was an attempt to probe German defenses and tie down Hitler's troops in the north. The fish oil factory and coastal defenses were blown up before the commandos withdrew. Eight months later, Canadian and British troops were sent in to mount a more ambitious raid on the French port of Dieppe. It too was designed to test the defenses and also to provide combat experience for the Canadians. But this time, it was a catastrophe. As landing craft approached the main beach, they were met by withering fire. Those troops that made it ashore were immediately pinned down. Behind them, the supporting tanks became bogged down in the shingle. Few managed to scale the sea wall. Over 3,000 Allied soldiers were killed or taken prisoner. Britain had learnt an important lesson. Never attempt a direct assault on a German-occupied port. Equally importantly, the Dieppe disaster reinforced the British view that an invasion of Europe could not be rushed. Churchill understood it would require careful planning. Eventually, in April 1943, at an Allied conference in Washington, Churchill and the US President Franklin Roosevelt agreed upon a date. D-Day, or Operation Overlord as the seaborne invasion of France was formally called, would take place in the summer of 1944. But by now, the Germans were preparing for it in earnest. Since the winter of 1941, they had been building an Atlantic wall. It was a massive series of fortifications running along the European coast from Denmark to the Spanish border. Gun emplacements had been constructed at likely landing sites. Beaches had been mined and covered in barbed wire. Obstacles had been placed in strategic places to block landing craft. Hitler had boasted, "I am the greatest builder of fortifications of all time." In the summer of 1942, in the wake of the Dieppe attack, work on the Atlantic Wall had been stepped up. Hitler had also ordered an increase in troop numbers in the region. The German overall commander in the west, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, had been given 15 further divisions. But the Western European coast stretched for some 2,000 miles. He didn't have the numbers to man the entire length. Von Rundstedt faced a difficult decision. Where should he position his overstretched forces to maximize their effect? The question led to bitter arguments inside the German leadership. Von Rundstedt proposed holding a large force of panzers in reserve northwest of Paris. He could then send it in against an invasion once he knew where it was happening. But the hugely respected Field Marshal Erwin Rommel commander of the troops covering the sector from Holland along the French coast to the Loire, had a different view. Rommel's concern was Allied air power. He'd seen it firsthand when he'd fought the British in North Africa, and it had left a profound impression. He feared that any counterattack would be broken up by Allied aircraft long before it could go into action. Rommel had also inspected Hitler's Atlantic Wall and found much of it wanting. It had forced him to the conclusion that the best place to position the panzers was as close as possible to the most likely landing sites. That way, an invasion could be immediately pushed back before it got a foothold. Hitler compromised. Rundstedt was given a small force he could hold in reserve, though Hitler himself would have the final say as to when it could be used. The rest of the additional troops was scattered along the entire Atlantic seaboard, in accordance with Rommel's wishes. It would turn out to be the worst of all the solutions. There were neither enough reserves nor enough tanks near the coast. But in the autumn of 1943, none of this was clear. In Britain, the Allied planners were also grappling with the problem of location. Where was the best place to land? Their chief planner, General Frederick Morgan, quickly realized there were two principal options: the Pas-de-Calais and Normandy. The Pas-de-Calais was clearly the favorite. It offered the shortest sea crossing, and it offered the shortest and most direct way to Germany. But it was also the most obvious route, and Morgan was sure the Germans were expecting it. So he decided to wrong-foot them. Morgan would land in Normandy. It was the beginning of a huge gamble on which the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers would depend. In the autumn of 1943, Allied photo reconnaissance aircraft swept over the beaches of northern France. It was part of a huge planning operation for the seaborne invasion of Europe. The fortifications of the Atlantic Wall were monitored by the French resistance. Men crept ashore to collect sand samples to test whether armored vehicles could be landed. Northern France became the most reconnoitered coastline in the history of warfare. It soon became clear any landing would need some kind of port facilities. But the disaster at Dieppe had shown that it was too dangerous to attempt a direct assault on a German-occupied port. Britain's planners were forced to come up with an ingenious alternative. Giant hollow concrete boxes were constructed in Britain that could later be towed to the French coast. There they would be sunk to form an artificial harbour. They were known by their code name, mulberries. The mulberries would be supplied with fuel by a pipeline unwound from giant reels and dropped on the seabed. It would run for 100 miles. The pumping station on the Isle of Wight was disguised as an ice cream parlour. But the raid on Dieppe had also revealed a second problem: how to get the first wave of troops off the beaches and through the German fortifications. The man told to solve that question was General Percy Hobart, one of the pioneers of armoured warfare. Hobart came up with a series of ingenious devices. The troops called them the funnies. They included such extraordinary machines as flamethrowers and floating tanks, flail tanks for clearing mines, the bobbin for laying firm paths across sand or shingle, an armoured ramp for climbing sea walls, the fascine carrier for tackling ditches, and the bridging tank for wider obstacles. That left just one problem: how to stop the Germans rushing in overwhelming reinforcements before the Allies had established a foothold. The answer was to keep them guessing until the very last moment as to where the invasion would take place. Operation Bodyguard was a massive and complex deception campaign. German double agents in Britain now began sending back to Germany huge amounts of carefully coordinated false information. This emphasized that the main landings would be in the Pas-de-Calais, although a feint attack might be launched in Normandy. To muddy the waters still further, the Allied military created a fictitious army unit, the so-called 1st US Army Group, or FUSAG. It was stationed, very obviously, in Kent, bang opposite the Pas-de-Calais. The man in charge of it was the pistol-toting US General George Patton, who'd been removed from action in Sicily after slapping shell-shocked soldiers. Patton was rated by the Germans as the Allies' best attacking general, just the man they expected to command the invasion of Western Europe.
Basher 5-2, this is Basher 1-1 on Alpha.
Radio transmissions mimicked the wireless traffic of an army. For the benefit of any Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft flying over Britain, the fields of Kent were filled with inflatable tanks and carefully faked track marks. There were dummy aircraft made of wood and canvas. Harbours along the Kent coast were filled with dummy landing craft. There were even troops, though these were in reality backup units. In late 1943, the Allies appointed US General Dwight Eisenhower as Supreme Allied Commander for the invasion of Europe. British General Bernard Montgomery would be in overall command of the initial assault troops. D-Day was fixed for June the 5th, 1944. "2 months before the landing, Eisenhower launched an elaborate air offensive to disrupt German links to the coast. Once again, it was carefully planned to give the impression the Allies' target was the Pas-de-Calais region. As the date of the invasion approached, Allied troop numbers in England reached over 2 million. They were supported by more than 3,000 tanks and 12,000 aircraft. The Germans were well aware an invasion was imminent. But they had been completely taken in by the Allies' phony preparations in Kent and were convinced the most likely landing spot was the Pas-de-Calais. Everything seemed to be going the Allies' way. The troops were briefed. Then the weather turned against them. Rain lashed down, visibility was poor, and the channel was stormy. Nevertheless, on June the 4th, 1944, the assault troops boarded their landing ships and the armada of more than 5,000 vessels set sail. But the rain continued to lash down, and later that day the invasion had to be postponed. The ships returned to port, and the assault troops faced a nerve-shredding wait. Early the next morning, the military leadership met again. The naval commanders were keen to go ahead. But the air chiefs were doubtful. They worried the visibility would still be too poor to provide effective air support. After a long silence, Eisenhower looked up. "Let's go," he said. Operation Overlord, the greatest seaborne invasion ever, was underway. D-Day had begun. At 1:15 in the morning of June the 6th, 1944, British aircraft towing gliders arrived over the coast of northern France. Then the gliders were released and plunged down to capture vital bridges over the Caen Canal in eastern Normandy. The Allies had launched their great gamble to invade Hitler's empire in Western Europe. "50 miles to the west, US paratroops came down around the village of Saint-Mère-Église. There was a fierce firefight. But 3 hours later, the village was in US hands. One of the most crucial battles of World War II was underway. An hour later, horrified German sentries along the Normandy coast saw a vast armada appear out of the mist. They had had no warning. The Allied fleet had sailed under cover of darkness. Moreover, Allied countermeasures had confused the German radar into believing the main weight of the attack was approaching the French coast further east at the Pas-de-Calais. Allied warships off the Normandy coast now began pounding the German defensive positions. Wave after wave of aircraft swept overhead. Under cover of the bombardment, assault troops headed for the shore. But as they closed in, German artillery and machine guns opened fire. A number of the landing craft were hit. Others fell foul of underwater obstructions. But at 6:30 in the morning, the first waves of troops hit the beaches. At the far western end, the US 4th Infantry Division came ashore near at what they called Utah Beach. Within 2 hours, it was linking up with the US paratroopers who'd landed at Saint-Mère-Église. Next door, at Omaha Beach, it was more difficult. The beach was a defender's dream, with high cliffs and few ways inland. As the US 1st Infantry Division waded ashore, they were mown down by German machine guns. To make matters worse, the Americans' amphibious tanks were swamped. The troops were trapped on the beach. Disaster was looming. But finally, a few of the soldiers managed to scale the cliffs. Against all the odds, the Americans hung on to the beachhead. Further east, in the center of the landing area, Britain's 50th Infantry Division came ashore at Gold Beach. They too met savage fire. But now, the British deployed their funnies. The troops were soon moving inland. At the adjoining landing spot, Juno Beach, the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division faced a similar situation. Here too, Britain's funnies were vital in helping the troops off the beach. Finally, on the far left flank, at Sword Beach, the British 3rd Infantry Division met only patchy resistance. Within hours, its commandos had linked up with the glider-borne troops at the Caen Canal. By early afternoon, the Allies had successfully established all of the beachheads. The timing of the invasion had caught the Germans completely by surprise. They'd expected the Allies to wait until the weather had cleared. Rommel, the operational German commander for the whole of the northwest French coast, had taken the opportunity of bad weather to visit his family in Germany. His immediate subordinate in Normandy and Brittany, General Friedrich Dollmann, was over 100 miles away, taking part in a war game exercise. Only the overall German commander for the whole of Western Europe, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, was at his HQ. But he needed Hitler's permission to move his panzer reserves to the battlefield. However, Hitler was asleep, and his aides wouldn't wake him. It wasn't until midday that the Führer finally learnt about the invasion, but he didn't take it seriously. He was still convinced the main attack would come in the Pas-de-Calais. Normandy, he believed, was just a feint. Finally, in the late afternoon, when the scale of the invasion was becoming all too clear, Hitler unleashed his reserves. But they were too far away to provide immediate support. Despite stubborn German resistance, the beachheads around Utah, Gold and Juno and Sword were secure. Only at Omaha was the situation more precarious. Here, German resistance had prevented the US troops moving more than a mile inland. By nightfall on June the 6th, over 100,000 Allied troops had been landed in Normandy. It had been an extraordinary feat of planning, ingenuity, and courage. The first day of the Allies' great gamble had paid off. But it was just the beginning. Now they had to build up, break out, and push on into Europe. As the second day dawned on the greatest seaborne invasion ever attempted, thousands of Allied troops had broken out of their beachheads and were moving inland. But they found the Normandy countryside hard going. The patchwork of woodland and small fields provided ideal terrain for German tanks and machine guns. The Allies suffered heavy casualties. Allied air power provided crucial support. When von Rundstedt's panzer reinforcements arrived, they'd been so depleted by the air attacks that they were unable to mount a major counterattack. The German reinforcements were also hampered by French resistance fighters, operating behind German lines. They ambushed troop convoys and blew up bridges. As a result, the Das Reich SS Panzer Division took over 2 weeks to make a journey which should have lasted a mere 3 days. Its troops took out their fury on the French civilian population. The village of Oradour-sur-Glane and its 642 inhabitants were wiped out. After 4 days of fighting, all the Allied beachheads were finally able to link up. But they'd still only managed to penetrate 10 miles inland. Eventually, 6 days after the landing, the British commander, General Montgomery, launched a major assault on the strategically important town of Caen. The British 7th Armoured Division, the Desert Rats, advanced. But its spearhead ran into 4 German Tiger tanks. The Allies' Sherman tanks were completely outclassed. Their guns were outranged and their shells unable to penetrate the German armor. They were particularly vulnerable because many ran on petrol fuel and were liable to burst into flames when hit. The Germans nicknamed the Sherman the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter, or more macabrely, the Tommy Cooker. In less than 5 minutes, more than 10 British tanks were destroyed. The attack on Caen stalled. Outmatched by the German tanks, the Allies relied on air power and artillery. But it wasn't enough. The Desert Rats retreated. Caen remained in German hands. Meanwhile, further west, US forces advanced on the equally important port of Cherbourg. It would take them nearly 10 days to get close to it. They weren't helped by the weather. During the first week of the invasion, it had been relatively calm, and supplies and reinforcements had poured in through the Mulberry artificial harbours. But now the weather turned. Gales swept the English Channel. The US Mulberry Harbour at Omaha was destroyed. The other Mulberry, in the British sector, was badly damaged and put out of action for several days. The flow of reinforcements slowed. It meant the port of Cherbourg was an even more vital objective. As the US forces now approached it, the German garrison resisted. There was fierce house-to-house fighting. It would take the Allies a week to secure the city. But the port had been trashed by the fleeing Germans. It would take a further month before it could be brought back into service. Meanwhile, Montgomery launched another assault on Caen. But the storms had turned the fields into a sea of mud. Low cloud meant air support was impossible. make matters worse, the newly arrived elite German 2nd SS Panzer Corps was thrown into the defense of the city. After 4 days, the British were, again, forced to halt. Then, as the clouds cleared, nearly 500 Allied bombers devastated Caen. British troops fought their way into the north suburbs. But the ruins made ideal defensive positions for the Germans. Allied casualties mounted. After 48 hours, the attack was, yet again, called off. 3 weeks later, Montgomery tried for a 4th time. The plan was to capture the remaining German strongholds and then push on south, deeper into France. After 2 more days of fighting, the city was finally won. The way now seemed open for the British tanks to move south, deeper into France. But the Germans were waiting with a large force of panzers. The British advance stopped again. The Americans in the west, however, were having an easier time. The fighting around Caen had sucked in the majority of the German defenders. As the American forces prepared to thrust further into France, they faced only scattered opposition. The scene was set for the Allied forces to break out at last. At 9:30 in the morning of July the 25th, 1944, over 1,800 Allied aircraft carpet-bombed a 4-mile stretch of the German front line south of Cherbourg. It was the beginning of Operation Cobra, the US breakout into France. The German defenders were stunned by the size of the assault. But so too were some of the US soldiers. The plan had been for the bombers to fly in from the east, parallel to the US front line, to minimize the risk of bombing American troops. But most of the aircraft came in over the top of the US lines. Bombs fell short. Over 100 US troops were hit and killed. Yet despite the ferocity of the bombardment, when the US forces later picked themselves up and moved forward, they found to their astonishment substantial numbers of German troops had survived. The survivors mounted a stubborn resistance. As fighting raged, it looked as though the Americans would fail to break through the German lines. But then, the German defenses crumbled. next morning, US tanks broke through and moved forward into open country. There was now almost no German resistance left, and the Americans quickly pushed deeper into France. The hill town of Coutances fell. Then the crossroads town of Avranches. As the Allies pressed forward, they were helped by change and confusion in the German high command. At the beginning of July, 3 weeks after the D-Day landings, Hitler dismissed the German commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, for defeatism. Von Rundstedt had made little attempt to hide his belief that Germany faced an unwinnable struggle. He was replaced by Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, fresh from the Eastern Front, but with little knowledge of northwestern France. Two weeks later, Rommel, the second most senior German officer on the front, was severely injured when his staff car was strafed by a British fighter. Then, with the Nazi command already in confusion, there was an assassination attempt on Hitler's life. On July the 20th, 1944, a disillusioned aristocratic war hero, Colonel Klaus Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg, planted a bomb in the planning hut at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. Four officers were killed. But Hitler was sheltered by a heavy, solid oak conference table and escaped with only minor injuries. The plot was swiftly and brutally put down. Von Stauffenberg was shot and his principal collaborators put on trial. They would later be hanged. Hitler put a brave face on it and visited some of the wounded in hospital. But it hardened still further his distrust of his senior officers. He would, despite his many earlier misjudgments, demand even greater control over events on the battlefield. Back in France, General George Patton, back in charge of a real fighting force, ordered his troops to fan out. They took Rennes, Mayenne, and headed for Le Mans. They were now moving round behind the German forces, still battling it out with the British and Canadians near Caen. With the Americans to their south and the British to their north, it seemed the German forces in Normandy would be surrounded. Hitler issued his usual order that there should be no retreat, but as the Allies squeezed in on them, the Germans began to flee. They were remorselessly harried by Allied aircraft and artillery. The casualties were appalling. Finally, on August the 20th, 1944, the Allied forces moving in from both the north and south met up. The so-called Falaise Gap, named after the nearby French village, had been closed. Large numbers of Germans were trapped. over 10,000 more Germans caught in the Allied pincer died. A further 50,000 were taken prisoner. The German army in Western Europe was in chaos. Meanwhile, far to the south, on the French Mediterranean coast near Cannes, there was a second Allied seaborne invasion. US troops came ashore virtually unopposed. They were helped by paratroopers from the Free French Army, men who had escaped from German-occupied French territory in Europe and North Africa. The landing had always been opposed by the British, who regarded it as a diversion. But the United States had long regarded it as an essential part of clearing the Germans out of France. The troops were greeted by an ecstatic civilian population. It was soon advancing rapidly up the Rhone Valley. Lyon was liberated on September the 3rd, 1944. Ten days later, they reached Dijon and made contact with Patton's forces advancing from western France. German units stationed across the region fled. In barely 3 weeks of headlong advance, the Allied invasion of Europe had liberated most of France. That left Paris, where French resistance fighters now rose up against the German occupation. There seemed little to prevent the Allied onrush from continuing to the German border. By early 1945, Hitler's Third Reich was entering its death throes. In the west, Allied forces had pushed to within striking distance of the Rhine. In the east, the Red Army was crossing the Polish border into Germany. As the Allies battled their way towards Berlin from east and west, the Germans fought them all the way. But it was a hopeless task. By May 1945, Hitler would be dead and Germany finally defeated. February 1945, and the Allied forces in the west had assembled near the Rhine for the final push into Germany. In the north were the massed ranks of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group. To its south was General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group. It included the US 3rd Army, commanded by General George Patton. On February the 8th, Montgomery's Army Group launched a two-pronged assault on German forces defending the Rhine. The northern prong had to fight its way through the wooded countryside. The southern prong was delayed when the Germans released water from a series of dams, flooding the surrounding area. It would be over 2 weeks before the two prongs met up on the west bank of the Rhine. By early March 1945, Montgomery's forces were in control of some 60 miles of the west bank of the river. The next task was to cross it. South of Montgomery, Bradley's armies were also moving eastwards, looking for a route across the river. On March the 7th, 1945, they reached the Rhine at Cologne. But Hitler had ordered all the bridges to be destroyed. Then, as the US forces explored further south, they found one bridge still intact near the small town of Remagen. They made a dash for it, brushing aside German resistance. Then, just as they were about to cross it, there was an explosion. But against the odds, the bridge remained standing. A small group of Americans raced across it, desperately cutting any wires that looked like demolition cables. US commanders began to push men across as fast as possible. The Allies had at last penetrated the German heartland. In Berlin, news of the capture of the bridge at Remagen infuriated Hitler. 5 junior officers were court-martialed. 4 were shot. In addition, the long-suffering German commander in the west, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, was sacked. It was the second time it had happened to him in less than a year. He was replaced by veteran commander Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who'd been in overall charge in North Africa and Italy. Over the next week, the Germans launched desperate air attacks to try and destroy the bridge at Remagen. None of them succeeded. Then, suddenly, on March the 17th, while combat engineers were repairing it, the bridge unexpectedly collapsed. 28 men plunged to their deaths. The first Allied thrust into Germany had been blocked. Meanwhile, further north, Montgomery was preparing the first full-scale Allied crossing of the Rhine. On March the 23rd, 1945, he launched an aerial bombardment on German forces defending the east bank of the river. Some 200 RAF Lancaster bombers virtually flattened the town of Wesel. Then British commandos in Buffalo amphibious vehicles crossed. They met little opposition from the dazed German defenders. Other divisions followed. The crossing lasted all night. The following day, in the largest airborne operation of the war, 17,000 men of British 6th and US 17th Airborne Divisions were dropped to seize key positions east of the river. They were met by heavy German anti-aircraft fire. A newsreel report told the story.
In a short time, hundreds of gliders make their hazardous landings, their men beginning the fight as soon as they land. One glider has its wing shot away when only 50 feet from the ground.
More than half the gliders were destroyed or damaged before landing. But within hours, the paratroopers linked up with Montgomery's land forces and the Allied bridgehead was secured. It should have been, for the ferociously competitive Montgomery, a moment of glory. But he'd been upstaged. The night before, his great rival, General Patton, had unexpectedly crossed the Rhine near Oppenheim and had already entered Germany. It was a sign of the intense rivalry between Montgomery and American commanders as they competed to be the first into Germany. Over the next few days, there were more Allied crossings. German defenses along the Rhine collapsed. In the north, Montgomery now pushed deeper into Germany, towards Munster. In the south, Bradley's forces, including Patton's Third Army, pushed east towards Marburg and Lauterbach. The major German city of Frankfurt am Main was circled and bypassed. Die-hard German troops fought back ferociously. But by now there was no question that the Germans were finished. The only issue was when they would realize it. As the Western Allies battled their way across West Germany, Stalin's Red Army in Poland prepared to launch a major offensive on Germany's eastern border. Hitler's forces in the region were poorly equipped and ill-prepared to repel an attack. The supplies of weapons had run so low, they were reduced to using First World War rifles. German intelligence estimated the Red Army's infantry outnumbered them 11-1. The Russians also had vastly more tanks and artillery. But the Germans had nothing left. Hitler's strategic reserve had already been used up on the Western Front. On January the 12th, 1945, the Russian offensive began with the usual artillery barrage. It stretched along a 300-mile front. A week later, the Red Army drove into the devastated remains of Warsaw. They then pushed westwards towards the German border, 300 miles away. To the south, a second Soviet force took the Polish town of Krakow on January the 18th. As the Soviet forces now raced westwards on a broad front across Poland, they left behind pockets of German resistance in cities like Poznan and Breslau. These would later be mopped up. By the end of January 1945, Soviet troops had crossed the German border and reached the river Oder. The Russians were now just an hour's drive east of Berlin. For the veteran Russian commander Georgy Zhukov, it had been a triumph. He had traveled 300 miles in just 14 days. It was one of the fastest and longest blitzkrieg advances in military history. Zhukov's troops now paused to catch their breath and bring up supplies. They were soon joined by a second group of Soviet armies that dug in to their south on the river Neisse. Meanwhile, a third Russian force penned the remnants of the German armies in East Prussia into the Baltic port of Königsberg, Kaliningrad today. Hitler had appointed the SS chief Heinrich Himmler to command his forces in the neighboring region. It was a sign of how deeply he had come to distrust his army generals. But Himmler had no military knowledge or experience. During February 1945, troops under Himmler's command were torn apart by Russian forces moving west. This time Hitler could have sent reserves. A large force of German troops still occupied the Courland Peninsula in neighboring Latvia. But in another bizarre decision, Hitler refused to allow it to break out and provide assistance. He was still committed to holding on to land, his Lebensraum, however irrelevant or wasteful it might now be. It meant some 200,000 German troops spent the final months of the war doing nothing. The Red Army now prepared for its final assault on Berlin. It lay less than 50 miles away. In Germany, the imminent Soviet invasion caused mass panic among the civilian population. The Russians had seen firsthand the horrors perpetrated by the Germans in the Soviet Union. They'd witnessed whole towns and villages destroyed, their inhabitants massacred. They were now very clearly looking for revenge. There were horrific tales of Russian rape, murder, and pillage. In snow and bitter sub-zero temperatures, more than 5 million German civilians on the Eastern Front fled their homes and flooded west to seek refuge. 2 million people were evacuated by sea from German-held ports along the Baltic coast. They were easy pickings for Soviet submarines. "24 German passenger ships were torpedoed. They included the cruise liner Wilhelm Gustloff, which had over 10,000 people on board. Barely 1,000 survived, the worst loss of life ever in a single incident at sea. Hitler's acting Chief of Staff, General Heinz Guderian, now urged the Führer to bring back any units that could be spared from the Western Front to defend Berlin. Hitler agreed and brought back the elite 6th SS Panzer Army. But he didn't send it to Berlin. He sent it to Hungary. He had become obsessed with defending Germany's last remaining source of oil, the Hungarian oil field west of Lake Balaton. It was an ill-considered decision. In Hungary, the panzers were hopelessly outnumbered by the Russians. To make matters worse, the weather conspired against them. A sudden thaw turned the ground into a sea of mud. For several days, the panzers struggled to hold back the advancing Russians. But they were steadily forced back into Austria. Soon they were drawn into the defense of Vienna as the Red Army advanced towards the Austrian capital. But 6th SS Panzer Army was a spent force. Its commander, SS General Sepp Dietrich, had no illusions. "We call ourselves," he said, "the 6th Panzer Army because we have only 6 panzers left." On April the 10th, the Red Army swept them aside and took Vienna. As they did so, the question now became, who would be the first to reach Berlin? Would it be the Red Army or the Western Allies? The race for Berlin had become not just a military, but a political issue. By March 1945, the Red Army was lined up along the River Oder, awaiting a final assault on Berlin. It presented the Allied military command in the West with a dilemma. Berlin was less than 300 miles from their advanced positions. Most Allied commanders wanted to race to the city to beat the Russians. But at a conference a month earlier in the Black Sea port of Yalta, the Allied leaders had divided up Germany into zones of influence. Berlin was firmly inside the Russian zone. So Eisenhower was instructed to tell his commanders to ignore Berlin and spread out to take the rest of the country. April the 1st, US troops surrounded the German industrial cities in the Ruhr. German soldiers occupying the area put up a stiff resistance. When, 2 weeks later, the area fell, more than 325,000 troops were taken prisoner. It was one of the largest number of German prisoners taken in the war so far. The German commander, the die-hard Nazi Field Marshal Walter Mödel, committed suicide. Elsewhere in the country, resistance was more patchy, and General Bradley's armies stormed across Germany. By April the 18th, 1945, the US forces had punched a corridor through to the Czech border, splitting Germany in two. Meanwhile, north of the Ruhr, Montgomery's Canadian First Army began the liberation of Holland. The Dutch had suffered horrendously during the bitter winter of 1944-1945. The German occupying force had deliberately taken supplies of food and fuel from the country to use elsewhere. There had been widespread deaths from starvation and cold. The Dutch town of Arnhem was seized on April the 15th, 1945. Progress was rapid, and on the following day the Canadians had liberated Groningen, close to the Dutch north coast. That left a German army virtually intact, but surrounded near Amsterdam. Soon afterwards, a ceasefire was negotiated. Allied aircraft now roared over the Dutch countryside, dropping food and medical supplies. At the same time, the British Second Army, also under Montgomery's command, pushed fast across the North German plain. Osnabrück fell on April the 4th. The British were soon at the German port of Bremen. Here there was fierce German resistance. It took 9 days of house-to-house fighting before the port was secured. Two days later, Montgomery's British forces reached the Elbe at Lauenburg. As the Allies advanced across Germany, they now came across horrific new evidence of the Nazis' final solution. In early April 1945, US troops overran a concentration camp at Ohrdruf, near Weimar, in central Germany. A visibly shocked General Eisenhower paid a visit. The SS had evacuated most of the prisoners, but they had left behind piles of bodies. 8 days later, British troops overran another concentration camp at Belsen, north of Hanover. Here they discovered over 70,000 prisoners. Thousands were already dead. The remainder were starving and disease-ridden. A radio broadcast by the BBC correspondent Richard Dimbleby gave the horrific details.
I passed through the barrier and found myself in the world of a nightmare. The living lay with their heads against the corpses, and around them moved the awful ghostly procession of emaciated, aimless people, with nothing to do and no hope of life, unable to move out of your way, unable to look at the terrible sights around them. It was as though they were waiting their turn. This is what the Germans did. Let there be no mistake about it, did deliberately and slowly.
Meanwhile, far to the south, in Italy, the German front was also starting to collapse. The German forces were dug in across the Apennine Mountains. Field Marshal Sir Harold Alexander, the Allied commander in the Mediterranean, now launched a spring offensive. On April the 9th, 1945, British troops attacked, pulling German forces in from along the front. Five days later, US troops also moved forward and swiftly reached the south bank of the River Po. The Germans retreated to the north bank. But Hitler's commander in Italy, General Heinrich von Wietinghoff, had no illusions that he could hold back the Allied advance for long. So he now made approaches to the Allies, and on April the 29th surrendered unconditionally. It would take effect from May the 2nd, 1945. This was the first formal surrender of German forces anywhere in Europe. The war was moving swiftly towards a conclusion. Back in Germany, American and Russian forces had by now met up on the Elbe near Leipzig.
The moment the world has been awaiting so long, when a lie from west meets a lie from east. The meeting was achieved on April 26, when a detachment of the American 69th Infantry Division, under Major General Reinhardt, was rowed across the Elbe to the Russians assembled on the far bank.
The stage was set for the final assault on Berlin. Hitler was desperate. He now turned to the old and very young for help in defending the city. His 1,000-year Reich was preparing for its final, apocalyptic struggle to survive. On April the 1st, 1945, Joseph Stalin summoned his top commanders to Moscow to receive their orders for the capture of Berlin. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, Russia's most successful commander, would make the main assault from his bridgehead on the Oder River. A second group of Soviet armies, under Marshal Ivan Konev, would cross the river Neisse further south and push deep into Germany, bypassing the German capital. Between them, they represented a massive Soviet force of over 2.5 million men. They were equipped with 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and 40,000 guns, mortars, and rocket launchers. But the Germans were never going to make it easy. The city was defended by about 1 million troops. Many were dug into strong defensive positions, particularly along the Silo Heights, a steep escarpment rising out of the Oder Valley and slap in front of Zhukov's point of assault. The defenders were a mixed bunch of combat veterans, SS fanatics, and inexperienced conscripts, some as young as 14, as well as elderly members of the Volkssturm, or People's Army. By now, Hitler had retired to a bunker under the Reichschancellery in Berlin. He was a heavily medicated and shambling figure who spent much of his time issuing increasingly unrealistic orders to largely imaginary armies. His public appearances were becoming ever more rare. But in early March, he was persuaded to visit some of the troops preparing to defend the Oder Line. Later in the same month, he emerged to inspect a small group of Hitler Youth soldiers. It was his last ever appearance before the cameras. Then, on April the 13th, 1945, the US President, Franklin Roosevelt, died of a heart attack. He had been one of the architects of the war, responsible for throwing America's might behind the Allied offensive. The Nazi propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, seized on the event to encourage his increasingly befuddled Führer to believe the Allied alliance would collapse. A German victory could still be snatched from the jaws of defeat. But any illusions were rapidly dispelled. 3 days after Roosevelt's death, Zhukov began his assault on Berlin. He had 1 gun for every 13 feet of the front. But the German defense had anticipated it and pulled back to avoid the bombardment. As a result, when Zhukov's infantry advanced, they met unexpectedly heavy resistance. Desperate to retrieve the situation, Zhukov threw in his tanks. But they too were soon bogged down. Meanwhile, to the south, the assault by Konev's second group of armies had gone better. His troops had crossed the Neisse River and were well on their way to the next obstacle, the River Spree. Stalin stoked the rivalry between his two commanders by authorizing Konev to swing his tanks north towards Berlin. He was only too happy to see a race to take the city. After 3 days of savage fighting, Zhukov's troops managed to enter the eastern suburbs of Berlin. At the same time, Konev was approaching the city from the south. There was desperate German resistance. But on April the 25th, the Soviet armies met up and the final assault on Berlin began. As the fighting moved on from district to district, civilians began to emerge from the cellars. But the Russians took little notice of the flags of surrender. The rape of German women and girls was widespread. After 3 more days of fighting, the city's remaining defenders were pinned down in a narrow strip of central Berlin less than 2 miles wide. Every street and house was contested. Then, on the morning of April the 30th, Soviet troops began an assault on the Reichstag, the German parliament building. Stalin regarded it as the symbol of Nazi power. They were stopped by heavy fire. So they blasted the building at point-blank range with heavy artillery. That evening, the Russians stormed it. Fighting raged from room to room and up and down corridors and staircases. It would take 4 hours before the red flag could be hoisted on one of the towers. The next morning, on May the 1st, 1945, the event was restaged for the cameras. But by then, Hitler was already dead. On April the 30th, as fighting raged overhead, the man whose insane ambitions had embroiled the world in war, laid waste a continent, and led to the extermination of millions of Jews, took his own life.
Sie wollten, Herr, kompromisslos die einzige Macht und alleinige Macht in Deutschland. Wir können glücklich sein zu wissen, dass diese Zukunft restlos...
His longtime mistress, Eva Braun, who he'd married the day before, died with him. Their partially burned bodies were buried in the garden of the Reichschancellery. But the fighting continued. Hitler had appointed Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz his successor, and for the next few days the new leadership attempted to salvage something from its nation's cataclysmic defeat. On May the 1st, 1945, the day after his death, German people were told that their Führer had fallen in battle. But they were told to continue the fight against the Bolshevik menace. But the German leadership was falling apart. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann tried to negotiate a city-wide ceasefire with the Russians. But the Russian commander, Marshal Zhukov, demanded unconditional surrender of all German forces everywhere. It was more than Goebbels and Bormann could deliver. Fighting in Berlin continued. Later that evening, Goebbels and his wife killed their 6 children and then committed suicide themselves. That same night, Bormann disappeared. Eventually, in the 1990s, DNA testing confirmed that a body found in Berlin was his. The next morning, Berlin surrendered. By mid-afternoon, all fighting in the city had stopped. Across the country, the pace of the German surrender now gathered momentum. The following day, Dönitz sent a delegation to the British commanding officer, Field Marshal Montgomery. He offered to surrender all German forces in northern Germany. Montgomery sent a reply saying he didn't have the authority to accept a surrender on behalf of the Americans or the Russians. He could only accept the surrender of those troops fighting him. Dönitz had no choice but to agree to Montgomery's terms. But that left Germany still fighting in the rest of the country. Dönitz now sent another delegation to General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, to discuss a peace deal with the West, but it carefully avoided any reference to a surrender to the Russians. Eisenhower rebuffed him and insisted that only the unconditional surrender of all German forces was acceptable. Once again, Dönitz was forced to back down. At 2:41 in the morning of May the 7th, 1945, at Eisenhower's headquarters in France, General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations throughout the 6 years of war, signed a document of unconditional surrender. Eisenhower's chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, signed for the Western Allies. General Ivan Suslopurov signed for the Soviet Union. The only member of the Allies' side not happy with the arrangement was Stalin. The Soviet Union had suffered too much to miss out on its own humiliation of the Germans. So Stalin countermanded Suslopurov and declared Russia would only accept a surrender in Berlin. It meant that the following day, Hitler's former chief of staff, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, signed a second surrender document to satisfy Stalin. Marshal Zhukov signed for the Soviet Union, with Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder signing on behalf of the Western Allies.
In January 1943, the late President Roosevelt and Premier Churchill met in Casablanca. There they pronounced the formula of unconditional surrender for the Axis powers. In Europe, that formula has now been fulfilled.
Across Europe and the United States, crowds began to celebrate the end of the war in Europe. From now on, the day after the German surrender, May the 8th, would be known as VE Day, Victory in Europe. But as the celebrations continued, many were aware of two very sobering issues. In the east, Japan was still fighting. And in Europe, the continent lay in ruins, and huge problems needed to be solved. Millions of Germany's concentration camp victims and slave laborers would need help to rebuild their lives. Millions of captured German fighting men had to be screened before being allowed to go home to identify and arrest major war criminals. The SS was a particular target. It had been responsible for some of the worst atrocities of the war. Leading Nazis like Hermann Goering, head of Hitler's Air Force, were rounded up and paraded in front of the cameras. Other top Nazis arrested included civilian leaders like Albert Speer and military leaders like Jodl and Dönitz. They would be put on trial in the German city of Nuremberg for crimes against humanity.
You must plead guilty or not guilty. Bekenne mich im Sinne der Anklage nicht schuldig. Rudolf Hess, you must plead guilty or not guilty.
Nein.
That will be entered as a plea of not guilty.
The Nazi leadership received sentences ranging from the death penalty to 10 years in prison. Goering committed suicide before he could be hung. Two months after the German surrender, the Allies met in the Berlin suburb of Potsdam. Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation: Soviet, British, American, and French. Berlin, although deep in the Soviet zone, was parceled up between the Allies in the same way. The peoples of Europe would also find themselves divided. Some would now live under the control of the Western Allies, some under Communist Russia. But before any of this could be faced, there was still the war in the Pacific to be won.